Well, I'd like to wish you a very joyous and Merry Christmas. When the season comes around every year, there are so many stories and so many images of what the spirit of Christmas is about, and I'd like to share one of my favorite stories with you. But let me do a bit of an introduction to put the story in context. As you know, for many, many years, I went on pilgrimage and took pilgrims along with me. Kelly and I would go to Assisi. And one of the places that we would always visit in Italy was Greccio, which is the town very dear to Francis of Assisi, where he staged a Christmas event one year. He sometimes is credited with actually creating the Christmas creche, the figures gathered around the the Christ child in the wise men and the shepherds and the angels and Joseph and Mary and so forth. Well, he may not have created it. It probably was part of evolving Italian tradition in the Middle Ages. But he put his stamp on it in a very particular way. And the creche is now associated with Francis. Uh, in some ways, it's been controversial in our own time, a religious symbol at Christmas. This is offensive to a lot of people. Of course, it is our feast. It is the feast of Christians, and we celebrate it publicly. It's not to disparage any other religious tradition. There are wonderful feasts in winter. Hanukkah, for example, a wonderful Jewish feast. And a little bit earlier, the Feast of Diwali, a Hindu feast. These are all very, very dear to me. But Christmas is Christmas, and I never say happy holidays. I extend the greetings of the Christ child at this time. And I wish people a merry meaning full of light and life, a Merry Christmas. So let me tell you the background to the story, and then I'll tell you the story. Francis succeeded in bringing peace and reconciliation to the two warring factions in his town of Assisi, where he grew up. Those warring factions reflected the grim political reality of Europe at that time, the struggle between the emperor and the pope, the church and the state. People took sides. Blood was shed over their wars. Many inglorious things were done in the name of the emperor or in the name of the pope. Francis himself, as a young man, wanted to become a knight and fight gloriously for the values of Christendom. He never did become a knight. Instead, he became a wandering minstrel, holy man, fool, and changed the world. But his wish to be a knight always remained with him. So his success, when his order drew many, many people, and his reputation grew, he was able to bring the mayor, in Italian, the podesta, the head of the civil government in Assisi, and the bishop of Assisi, who were bitter rivals. They hated each other. Okay, they not only opposed each other, they hated each other. And Francis very dramatically brought them to a place of reconciliation, where they wept and they begged each other for forgiveness. And so he brought peace to the small city of Assisi. That was always his goal. And when the Crusades continued, he, of course, would never go on a crusade now that he was not a knight, but, so to speak, a knight for Christ. He decided he would go to the Holy Land. And at that time, the battles that were raging there between Muslims and Christians about who would have political control over these lands, these biblical lands, it was centered on Egypt and on the city of Damietta in the Nile Delta of Egypt. So Francis went. He went on on pilgrimage. He went to encourage the Christian knights, the soldiers, to fight for what they believed in, to restore the Holy Land to the Christian community, but also to behave and to act with nobility and charity. He reminded them of that they were just not a rowdy band of warriors, but they had values that they were to hold to. So outside the walls of Damietta, he encouraged them. It was a long siege. It was a bitter, bitter struggle between the Muslims who were in the city and the Crusaders who were encamped outside the city. And during the time of the siege, his task, as he understood it, was to give counsel and to give encouragement to those young Christian soldiers. Now, not so much the people who sent them, the generals and the political leaders. That's what always happens in warfare. The higher ups make the decisions, and then young people have to bear the consequences. And so he encouraged them, he prayed with them, he held up their spirits, he encouraged them to be faithful to what their beliefs were, and yet to be gentle and compassionate, to be a true knight in the image of Christ, not to be a barbarian, not to be a terrible scourge on the earth. The city fell, and when the city fell, something terrible did happen. Francis saw that the knights did not, it was in the frenzy of their victory, and they succumbed to their worst base instincts. They breached the city walls, they entered, and they murdered people. They killed Muslim men, soldiers, defenders. They raped women. They pillaged the homes and the palaces for all the wealth that they could carry out, booty. It was a war crime. How else could you put it? That's what we would say now. And when we speak about post-traumatic stress syndrome and what has happened to young soldiers and the wars in our time, how they are traumatized by what they have done or what they have failed to do, we can understand how Francis was devastated by this. Yes, he went to visit the holy shrines, then under the control of the Sultan. He had permission, he met with the Sultan. The Sultan was very impressed with his holiness and his humility. Francis was very impressed with the Sultan. They had a dialogue. They tried to convert each other, so to speak. But the important thing was that they were both, in some sense, noble people and men of peace, one Muslim and one Christian. The Sultan gave Francis permission to visit the holy sites of Christendom in his land, and Francis fulfilled a lifelong dream. He went to Jerusalem, he went to Bethlehem, he went to all the holy places, and then he went back home. However, this pilgrimage of his was a traumatic one. He was filled with the images of what he had seen in Damietta. He had to live with the violation of the gospel, that people in the name of the gospel did what they did. We can understand that. We can understand that in our own time. The wars of the last half century, beginning with Vietnam, and going on to this day, the struggle with ISIS, terrorism, the tension in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. All of this is traumatic. And maybe that's why we turn at Christmas time to an island of peace, or we seek peace, at least in our own hearts. But let me get back to Francis. He went back and he went to Venice. Venice was the great seafaring power in Western Europe, and they transported the Crusaders back and forth between the Holy Land and Europe, probably at a great profit to these merchant seamen. And when he came there, there was a hermitage that the Franciscan friars, who had now spread all over Italy and all through Europe, and he took refuge there. He was very, very sick. You know, we don't really know what his sickness was from the historical records, but he was devastated. He couldn't go back to Assisi. He couldn't go back to his regular life, and he stayed there for a long time. Now, perhaps we would say he was suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. He needed to get away. He needed to reconcile himself with what had happened and what had not happened, and he did that. But it changed him. It changed him very, very profoundly. He had failed at bringing peace. This is his great accomplishment in Assisi when he brought the rivals of the emperor and the pope, the bishop and the mayor, who had fought against each other, been vicious with each other, betrayed each other, betrayed the gospel, and he had brought peace. One of his songs, his canticle, is about peacemaking. It's not only about brother, sun, and sister moon. That's part of it. That's the cosmic dimension, but it's about reconciliation and peacemaking also. So here is Francis, and he's come back, and he is devastated. And he's been to Bethlehem, and it was in the place of Bethlehem where Christ's child was born over 1,000 years before he was there. But there was something terribly, terribly wrong. So he slowly recovered, and he came back to Assisi. But as with post-traumatic stress syndrome, maybe you never totally recover. It troubled him, it bothered him, and he felt he needed to do something. And what he needed to do was he needed to find a different kind of Bethlehem. You know, Bethlehem, where the Christ child is born, the King of Kings, born humbly in humility, peace on earth, goodwill to men. And he knew it couldn't be in Assisi. Assisi had been changed by the events. He had become famous. He was a superstar, so to speak. And there was a lot of hustle and bustle, and people were coming to Assisi like they had gone to Jerusalem and Bethlehem to go to the place where the Holy Man came from. And he knew he couldn't do that. He had to find some way of going to what he would call the Bethlehem of the heart. Not the Bethlehem of geography, but the place of peace in the heart. He had to go to that moment where the Word of God is born in the flesh into the world. And like Meister Eckhart, who lived in the medieval times, a little bit later than Francis, Meister Eckhart, in his mystical reflections, his prayer life, an incredibly talented, beautiful, and creative man, said that it's not only the incarnation of the Word of the Father, God the Father, becoming flesh in the person of Jesus, both human and divine, but it's also an issue of the Word entering into our own hearts, so that we are transformed. You know, there's a saying in Christian spirituality, rooted in the Eastern Church, that God became man, or human. God became human so that humans could become God. So if we fully participate, if we accept, if we welcome the Word of God into our hearts, it's like St. Paul says in his epistles, "It is not I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me." So Francis made a decision, and that's the story that I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell the story after this. It's a story that I recorded last year, and I'd like to stay with that story. So there's not going to be any visuals or anything. It'll just be a short telling of the story. This is the background of the story. So he decides to go to Greccio. Now, he had been to Greccio many times before because he traveled between Assisi and Rome, especially when he was negotiating with the Pope on letting the friars become an established religious order and getting the approval of the Church for their understanding of their gospel mission. And to go by road between two places, it's a long journey. It's a couple of days of walking, and it goes over some very rough terrain, including a sort of a highland area where there's some marshes and so forth, the area of the Rieti Valley. It's a very beautiful place to this day, and there's a little village in there that's called Greccio. Greccio is now a shrine. People go there because they want to relive Francis's life, and he became friends with another young man about his age, Count Giovanni, who did become a knight, but who lived a noble life as a knight in service of his God, and a just man, a good man, a generous man. And Francis said, I'd like to celebrate Christmas Eve here, and I need your help. So as part of Francis's healing, to find the Bethlehem of the heart, and I think that is where we are in our time. Oh, we go home to our childhood home. Perhaps we remember idyllic times in childhood. We go to vacation spots at Christmas. We go to holy places at Christmas. We go to big churches and go to elaborate ceremonies and concerts and worship and so forth. But we're all looking for the peace of Christmas. And I think Francis found it. I think he has given us a way to enter into the Christmas spirit so that the spirit of the Christ child enters into us. Merry Christmas, joyful Christmas to you. And here is the story of Francis at Greccio. Enjoy the story and have a Merry Christmas.
St. Francis wanted to go home for Christmas. Oh, not to Assisi, where he had been born and raised, for Francis knew that that world was forever past and lost to him. And now God's little poor man was on the road all the time, preaching and teaching with the friars who were his companions. But Francis still longed for a Christmas gathering with grandparents and grandchildren, gathered around the table for a meal, gathered around the fire for warmth and stories. He remembered all of that from Assisi and from his childhood years ago. But he could not go back to the past. Assisi was no longer the childhood home of his memories. But if there was any place that was most home to Francis, it was that little village of Greccio, halfway between Assisi and Rome. Greccio was tucked high up in the mountains and surrounded by thick forests. The people who lived there were simple and honest and full of love for Francis. Now, in Greccio, there lived a nobleman, Count Giovanni, who was a very close friend of Francis. He was a wealthy and generous and just man who owned the mountain and the forests and the valley below. And so Francis asked Count Giovanni to help him prepare a different kind of Christmas this year. Giovanni was honored. He would of course have a great feast, but then he heard the details of Francis' requests. Francis asked, would Giovanni prepare one of his stables for the celebration of Mass on Christmas Eve? Francis asked, would he bring live animals into the barn for the liturgy? Francis asked, would he invite the shepherds and woodcutters and farmers from the village of Greccio? And finally, Francis asked, would Giovanni prepare a feeding trough with clean hay in it and place it close to the altar? Now, in those days, Christmas Mass had always been a most solemn and serious event, done with great pomp. Giovanni wondered, how could Francis want the whole village to come to an old stable to celebrate? For all his goodness, Giovanni was still a nobleman with all his airs of self-importance. Perhaps it was his one fault, so visible to everyone, that made Giovanni so endearing to Francis. Yes, Giovanni had his fault, but it was not a vicious one, just a poor human frailty. He wanted to be important in the eyes of others. St. Francis arrived with some of his friars the day before Christmas Eve, and they found all the preparations were completed by Count Giovanni's servants. Then Francis went deep into the woods to pray. Count Giovanni returned to his castle, and with his wife and children eagerly prepared for Christmas Eve. When darkness fell, the Count and the Countess stood outside on their castle tower, looking over the valley. It was a harsh landscape, but it was their home. Not many important people came this way, but the people of Greccio were good neighbors to the nobleman's family. Somehow the whole mountainside and the valley below seemed to belong to one family. The day was short, and the sky was dark with clouds. As the light faded, snow began to fall, large snowflakes drifting down slowly like feathers in the still air. But then the Count and Countess saw dozens and dozens of lights, burning torches lit by the farmers and shepherds and woodcutters, moving from all directions of this valley towards the little stable. They looked in amazement, and then the Countess said, "The Magi saw only one star, but we see hundreds of stars burning brightly in everyone's heart as they walk to the stable this night. I am so glad that we are not in some palace in Rome tonight. I am thankful we are home." And so they gathered, and since Francis was a deacon, he could preach and sing at this Mass. Oh, he sang and he preached that night in the stable. Giovanni's children loved to hear Francis sing and speak, for his voice was so sweet. He always sang them songs when they were put to bed at night, and so they loved his visits to Greccio. Again and again, that night the children heard him say the word Bethlehem in their own language. Bethlehem, Bethlehem. The children thought Francis sang as sweetly as a lamb would bleat its song. Bethlehem, Bethlehem. When the Mass was over, and everyone's attention turned towards the procession that led from the stable towards the castle, at that moment, everyone was thinking about the feast that the Count and the Countess had prepared, and everyone's eyes were turned away from the altar and the manger, except for Count Giovanni's. Count Giovanni turned. He turned back and he looked at the empty manger again. But this time he saw that it was not empty. This time he saw a little babe asleep in the trough on a bed of hay. Francis had specifically asked that the manger be empty. There was no doll in it. There was no child in it. But now there was. Giovanni then saw Francis step up to the manger and gently bend down and reach towards the child to softly awaken it. Whether others saw the same thing, Giovanni did not know, but he saw it, and he understood. He whispered to himself, My friend Francis is awakening the Christ child in each of us tonight. The child who has been asleep for so many years. Giovanni knew that Christmas would never again be formal and solemn. Christmas would now be simple and tender. St. Francis and the friars shared a feast in Giovanni's castle. The rich and the poor were all there, old grandparents and little children, poor woodsmen in rags, and the Count in all his finery. Yes, there were many differences, but that night the differences did not matter. Francis knew he was home for Christmas. And so every year, Giovanni and his family prepared a manger in their hearts. They emptied their hearts of all anger and desire. They opened the doors of their hearts for the Christ child. And so it is on Christmas Eve. In our hearts the Christ child rests until he awakes with us on Christmas morning.